Excellent. Thanks, Andrea. All right, well, welcome to Care Farming Network's April's monthly member gathering. As always, if you're new, or anyone joining us today, please feel free. You can introduce yourself in the chat with your name and your farm or organization, if applicable. And we love to see what state you're coming from, too. So please use the chat function for that. Quick introductions. I'm Kate Mudge. I'm a co-director at Care Farming Network. We have Andrea Barnhart, also co-director, joining us and helping keep things going behind the scenes. And we have Gabrielle too, and Gabrielle works on our accessibility and social media platforms. And Gabrielle is going to be leading on a couple of the slides that we have. So that's where you can find us here. Um, Really excited today to talk about the importance of establishing a shared language in care farming. I'm going to kick us off and just talk a bit about why it's important to speak the same language. But speaking the language, same language, helps create stronger connections within the care farming community. And a shared language also gives care farmers more credibility, which enables us to communicate the impact of our work more effectively. It's really important when engaging with funders and policymakers and partners, which we'll also be talking about, because using a consistent and inclusive language ensures that we are all seen as credible advocates for the work that we do. We want to avoid stigmatizing language that might misrepresent our mission. And I want to note at the onset of this presentation that we will have time for Q&A and discussion at the end, because one thing that's important to note is that we view this as an evolving conversation. We want Care Farming Network to be a central space for refining language and ensuring that it evolves alongside the growth of care farming so that it can be kept broad enough to capture the diversity of models that are in practice today. And we also want to acknowledge that we need spaces just like this so that we can co-create the language as a network. And so what is presented today in this presentation is really intended to be both informative, but also fluid and evolving. So we know that language is the primary tool for conveying ideas, goals, and narratives within a movement. It allows participants to understand the cause and to connect with each other. And that shared language creates a sense of community and belonging. It helps reinforce group identity and fosters solidarity and cohesion among those in a network, like Care Farming Network. Language can also be used to challenge dominant narratives and give voice to groups that are sometimes marginalized and vulnerable by helping to amplify their perspectives. And language, of course, can motivate people to take action, to help understand a mission or a problem, and to advocate for change. So just a quick question for you all who are joining us today. Again, please feel free to use the chat. This is just an idea that you can share that we have a question around in your work. Is there a term or a concept that you feel needs better definition or shared understanding around? And then when we get to the discussion, we'll talk about why some of the terms that we might struggle with feel unclear or open to interpretation. And again, would love to see if you have an idea, keep it there in the back of your mind or feel free to throw it in the chat. So let's frame the conversation about care farming. What do we mean when we talk about care farming? This is a newer movement here in the United States, and we believe that the language that we use should be inclusive enough to represent, again, the wide range of care farms and the models, and ensure that it reflects all of the ways and practices that support people who are involved in care farming. So on the right of this slide is language pulled directly from our website, and you can see that we use this definition. Care farming uses therapeutic farming to promote health, well-being, and belonging. So as we're framing the conversation, I want to share with you this green care umbrella that you might have seen before. I should also note that this slide presentation is going to be shared with all of you afterwards and does include links to the sources that we're citing. So the Green Care umbrella refers to a variety of therapeutic farming practices. These can range, as you see, from horticulture therapy to animal-assisted interventions, all of which aim to have the same promotion of well-being and social inclusion. And there's also other types of practices, such as therapeutic horticulture, ecotherapy, nature therapy, animal-assisted interventions, animal-assisted therapy. And we should just note that care farming is a term that's more common in the US, emphasizing therapeutic farming. Social farming, you might hear, it's a little bit more widely used in Europe, again, highlighting social inclusion and employment opportunities. And green care is this broad term encompassing all these nature-based interventions that we'll explore more. So Care Farming Network's definition does include that there is an intentional practice. I'll say that again, an intentional practice that combines agriculture with therapeutic interventions to promote health, well-being, and belonging. So when we're talking about care farming, we're talking about engaging with land and plants and animals to foster healing and growth. These experiences focus on social inclusion and community building and can provide meaningful work and skill development as well. For many people, care farming is an empowering activity where they can connect and they can learn and they can contribute, whether that's through agricultural tasks or educational programs or vocational training. Ultimately, care farming blends agriculture with therapeutic, educational, and vocational opportunities to create this holistic healing environment. And again, a key term to note here are the use of the word intentional with a targeted or focused population of people served. So as a network, it's also important to kind of clarify what we believe care farming is not. Care farming is not just a traditional farm. And while farming is at the heart of it, care farms provide structure and intentional programs focused on well-being, education, or vocational training. It's also not a hobby farm or an agritourism site. While these types of farms might have visitors or host events, care farms have a clear mission that focuses on inclusion and social impact and participant growth. Care farming is not an exclusive model. It embraces a wide variety of approaches, and there is no one-size-fits-all to integrate agriculture with health and social benefits. And furthermore, care farming is not a one-way service. It's about mutual engagement, meaning participants are not only receiving help, but they're also contributing to the farm's activities in really meaningful ways. And finally, while care farming is often nature-based, it's specifically designed to support targeted populations, not just anyone who enjoys being around nature. So it might be helpful to kind of discuss some examples here. So the next 3 slides go through the examples. And our first is a residential program for young people who are facing challenges related to a substance use and mental health. These individuals participate in a recovery program on a working farm, engaging in agricultural tasks like caring for livestock. So we ask, is this a care farm? And for Care Farming Network, yes, absolutely. They're an example of an animal using an animal-assisted intervention, which is a broad category that includes therapeutic practices in a farm setting. And this is actually an example of Roots at Evergreen Grove in Massachusetts. Another example, Greens Do Good. It's an indoor hydroponic farm in New Jersey. And the farm provides structured opportunities for neurodivergent individuals to grow greens as part of a therapeutic farming experience. So, is this a care farm? Yes, this is definitely a care farm. They use indoor farming, again, to promote health, well-being, and belonging, and they provide a structured space for neurodivergent individuals to thrive. It's a great example of how care farms can offer agriculture for vocational and skill building opportunities for targeted populations. Third example, we have a working alpaca and livestock farm that invites visitors for tours. They have events like shearing days, and they have an event like pumpkin picking. So is this a care farm?
No.
Well, this might be a lovely place to visit. We would not consider this a care farm. It's actually an example of agritourism, which combines farming and tourism. It's designed to provide education and entertainment, and while it might generate revenue, it doesn't focus on the therapeutic and vocational goals of care farming. So, going back to the question of why is all this language important? I've already talked about how language helps shape how we communicate to each other. Particularly, language is helping us communicate the benefits of care farming. It's the words that we use are influencing how people see our work and understand its value. And for example, using strength-based language, as some of these examples show, helps to highlight how care farming creates meaningful connections and fosters a sense of belonging, which all the while helps to increase awareness of care farming and invite the community to get involved. Care farming isn't just about helping people. It's about fostering inclusion and connection and purpose. So as you look at these examples, you can see that these provide some alternatives for perhaps improving the language that some of us are using. So when talking to the general public, it's important again to focus on real strengths-based messaging. So you can see some examples here of instead of saying one thing, a way of saying something else. This strengths-based language is really highlighting, again, the positive impact of care farming. It helps to build community engagement. It helps to build awareness of your farm in your community. And it also shifts the narrative away from deficits-based language. So different audience, funders, grant applicants. Know that many of you are writing grants and talking to people about supporting your work. Again, it's really crucial to use language that emphasizes the positive outcomes of care farming. So for example, rather than saying the befores, you can say the afters. It's more aligned with strengths-based approach, focusing on empowerment rather than need. And a third category of folks that you might have a bit different messaging for are policymakers and partners, because speaking with them is another opportunity to highlight the impact of your work. So we want to position care farming as a viable model that can be used for public health and social inclusion. So for example, instead of we serve people in need, there's a strengths-based approach to say our farm is a place where everyone, regardless of background or ability, can contribute, grow, and connect with nature. So using this language allows you, again, to focus on empowerment, not deficits. It emphasizes the inclusion and the purpose, and it helps to avoid framing as charity or therapy only. And highlighting this mutual benefit also shows care farming benefits both the individual and the broader community. So just some notes here around tailoring your language to your audience, whether they be funders or policymakers or the general public, because each can respond differently to that messaging. So for those of you who are familiar with our website, this might look like something that you've seen before. It's our online map and directory. And this is CFN's way of listing the members within the network. And you can see that we use language ourselves to categorize how care farms work and with whom. So you have your farming practice, you have population served, organization type, even some tags here. I'm including this map as an example of how CFN shows the diversity of care farms. Again, who you serve, whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit, what kinds of farming practices you might provide, and the model of the farms. For example, some farms might have a program licensed therapist, others might offer job skill training, or they might actually be a care farm that is a program of a service provider. And we want to take some time in the next few slides to explore what all of this means, because we're recognizing too, again, CFN, we're evolving along with you all. And as we share information and think about the terms that we're adopting and using, we also recognize the importance of having ongoing conversations with care farms to remain relevant and inclusive in the network. So we're in the process ourselves of updating and clarifying the language, because this map is very important to us. It is our go-to place that shows you the care farms throughout the country. We want to make sure that we're all speaking the same language and representing correctly. Which means that there are some terms that can be a little tricky at times. So get ready. There's a lot of information in the next slides. We have therapeutic horticulture. And as you'll see here, therapeutic horticulture, we are using the definition provided by the American Horticultural Therapy Association. And this is a bit different, not necessarily care farm or not care farm, but we want to be careful that when the AHTA is talking about therapeutic horticulture, they're noting that this is therapy that is provided by individuals who are credentialed. They have gone through a practice and have a certification to practice therapeutic horticulture. Animal-assisted intervention. This is a really broad term because so many care farms use animals. We wanted to explore this a little bit further. As you can see, animal-assisted intervention really involves structured interactions with animals to promote emotional and physical well-being. But there's a lot of different practices within this broad AAI that could include animal-assisted therapy, education, or activities. Again, these sources are listed so that you can have time to spend examining how people are defining their own work. We have kind of a broad category next of ecotherapy, wilderness therapy, nature-based therapy. They all work to improve mental health and well-being. There's some examples there. You might hear forest bathing, nature walks, outdoor mindfulness practices. The thing to note when talking about categories such as this is they are open to all, not necessarily a specific targeted population of people that they're serving, but beneficial nonetheless. And then we have farm-based education. Again, our source here is the Farm-Based Education Network. And this refers to structured experiential learning programs that do take place on working farms using agriculture, nature, and food systems as the foundation for teaching. Very much an educational forward approach. And yes, there's another link in there too that notes some of the values that are espoused through farm-based education. Going back to just the summary of animal-assisted intervention, again, this is the term that you'll find on our map. And it's a very broad term. There's a couple organizations, one is international and one is US based, that really delves into all of this, which is a chart that we put together. I'll be curious to hear in our discussion what people have to say about animal-assisted interventions, because it's thick and heady. But what we've tried to do here is kind of differentiate between the type of practice and what those goals are, who's facilitating it. Again, sometimes people need to be certified to be practitioners. Sometimes they don't. There are some examples here. and then the settings in which you might find some of these practices. Another topic or terminology, healing versus therapeutic. This is included, again, we're not experts on this, but maybe a little bit of differentiation for our discussion, that we think that healing really implies this personal journey toward emotional, mental, or physical well-being. Tends to be a little bit less clinical used, more holistic, kind of centered on the individual, whereas you have the term therapeutic, which often suggests more intentional activities or structure designed in a program. And it can be informal, such as therapeutic gardening, or clinical, which is horticultural therapy. One thing to note here is that care farms offer healing spaces, but not all are delivering structured therapeutic interventions.
Mm.
So I'm going to take a pause and introduce Gabrielle. Gabrielle is going to walk us through the next few slides. And I can try to highlight you, Gabrielle, if I can figure that out. But please explore the next few slides with us.
Hi. Yes. So the next few slides generally regard the population served of different care farms and how they're being served. Um, I guess that this is a little bit of a continuation of the prior few slides, but employment versus vocational slash job skill training is just an important distinction to make because some organizations use the term employment when they're talking about like employment preparedness, but they don't make it very clear. And so it's not very great for people who think, oh, I have an opportunity for paid work at this place, and that is not the case. And most places that have one actually like do have both. It seems like, but basically employment provides paid wages with built-in supports for individuals, focusing on job retention, workplace accommodations, and coaching. Whereas vocational skills or job skills training focuses on skill building and preparing individuals for employment in agricultural or other fields. And this may be short term, like we know some care farms have apprenticeships that last like 6 months or 1 year, whereas it can also be much longer than that. And sometimes this leads to job placement in that organization or partnered outside organizations, or further education. So, employment models provide long-term job support and wages, while vocational training provides skills to individuals for future employment opportunities. The next slide, please. So for populations served, the general thing about this is that if anything that is temporary or can be temporary, you do not want to make that someone's identity. So in those cases, you'll want to use person first language. For example, like a person um who is like recovering from addiction or substance use disorders isn't an addict or a former addict. They are, for example, a person impacted by substance use disorders or a person in recovery. Like if that makes sense, it's a person who experienced a thing, maybe is still experiencing a thing, but because this is a temporary thing, or at least can be a temporary thing, it's not inherently a part of their identity. Where person first versus identity first language gets a little bit more complicated is in terms of things like disability and other life experiences, which can be and like usually are lifelong. So, for example, I am autistic. I'm a person with autism. I have autism spectrum disorder specifically. And there is a lot of conversation, for example, within the autism community, about person first versus identity first language. And so there, basically, the main thing you want to do is be really meaningful and intentional about what your served population is, and at least try to get a sense, whether it's online, speaking with consultants, looking at organizations, on looking at like webinars on YouTube, things like that, Just being meaningful and intentional with the language that you use because it really isn't one size fits all. For example, like people who are deaf, tend to say that they are deaf with a capital D or that they are hard of hearing. With autism, it's kind of like it's not exactly a 50-50 split, but it's pretty close to that. Um, and with something like Down syndrome, like almost anyone would say like they have Down syndrome, not that they I don't know anyone who says that they are Down syndrome. Um, but yeah, so it's with disability in general, disabled is not a dirty word. You don't need to avoid saying disabled. You don't need to avoid saying disabilities. Um, Emphasizing, as earlier was spoken of with the strengths based model is good and all, but if you're using the word ability or abilities or abled as a way to avoid saying disabilities or disabled, then you're stigmatizing a word that is not a bad word. Disabled is not a bad word. Disabilities is not a bad word. And yeah, so these are just, there's a few other examples on here, but basically, yeah, like mentally ill individuals, is not usually a phrase you would use. Youth facing barriers or youth in different like the situations they're facing, the experiences they have. Basically that like youth is more of like an identity of who they are and then whatever they're experiencing, versus yeah, and then there's just a bunch of other examples on here. Okay, so the next slide gets a little bit more specifically into disability identities. So there are a lot of care farms. Around half of the care farms, I believe, in our network work with either neurodivergent individuals or individuals with IDD or both. So neurodivergent does include IDDs. It's a broad non-medical term referring to individuals whose brains function differently from the neurotypical population. This includes autism, ADHD, dyslexia, OCD, cerebral palsy, other cognitive differences. Intellectual and developmental disabilities, that's a medical and legal category referring to lifelong disabilities affecting cognitive function, learning, and adaptive skills. This includes conditions like Down syndrome, autism with intellectual impairment, and cerebral palsy. It does technically, developmental disabilities includes autism even without intellectual impairment. But yeah, so the in this population often the services that are provided to them are referred to as special needs. The phrase special needs usually isn't used to refer to a group of people themselves. Like you wouldn't call a person special needs. But like special needs or special education usually refers to services that are being provided or programs that are like available to people who, for example, need accommodations for different reasons. On the next slide, something else that's pretty common is people using neurodivergent and neurodiverse interchangeably when they don't exactly mean the same thing. So, neurodiversity is a recognition that not all brains think or feel the same way, and that these differences are natural variations in the human genome. A group of people can be neurodiverse. That can be, for example, a group of three people where one is neurotypical and one has ADHD and one has autism, and it can be an infinite amount of other combinations. But an individual is not neurodiverse. That's like saying that an individual is ethnically diverse, which, yeah, an individual is just one person, and diversity occurs within a group of people, or things. So neurodivergent is the term that, as we described on the prior page, refers to an individual who has a less typical cognitive variation such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc. This is a different definition than the one on the other page, I'm just realizing. But yeah, so that's just one thing between neurodiversity and neurodivergent. And it's totally cool to say that you're serving a neurodiverse population, or like you're a neurodiversity affirming care farm, or anything like that, because you're referring to the group that you're serving. But to say like we serve neurodiverse individuals would be, I guess, grammatically incorrect, because the individual is not neurodiverse. But if your care farm serves people with more than one neurotype, that's neurodiversity. If you specifically only serve people with Down syndrome, most scholars would say you're not necessarily a neurodiversity care farmer serving a neurodiverse population, but like that's arguably fine because like most people who have one thing have more than one thing. And so because we are all multifaceted and have comorbidities and co-occurring conditions and stuff, like even if you serve, for example, only individuals with Down syndrome, there's going to be neurodiversity within that group because some of them might also have other, they might have learning disabilities or other neurodivergent conditions. And then neurotypical finally refers to individuals of typical development and intellectual and cognitive functioning. Is this? Yes. So this is a word cloud of terms that care farms use to refer to their care farmers, their participants in their target population group. The most common one here is members. And then they have community, residents, clients, participants, gardeners, volunteers, workers, interns, team, family, program, apprentices, growers, and learners. And so a lot of these terms can be used interchangeably, but some of them, of course, are very specific to how you run your care farm. Um, if you're paying your care farmers, you're not going to call them volunteers. All of that's kind of self-explanatory. But I'm curious to see in the chat if there are any other words that aren't in this word cloud, that are basically like the title role of your care farmers on your farm. Um, yeah, I guess that's. Oh, the only thing, if you can go back a few slides, is the one thing that I forgot to say on the first slide about identity is that we at the Care Farming Network are not experts in many of these different identity groups. We at the Care Farming Network have a lot of experience working with groups with IDDs, and especially with autism. But if you are many of the people on this call like might actually be experts in some of these areas and we would love to hear from you. We put some examples just in the bullet points on here of like some of the terms that we've seen are more preferred by both professionals and people with lived experience in these different areas that care farms can serve. But we really will appreciate from anyone who has expertise in these areas, whether it's as a professional, as an academic, or with lived experience. If you share that information with us, we can share it with everyone in our network. So whether that's in terms of like the bullet point elders navigating dementia, or individuals impacted by the criminal legal system. There are many different ways to say a lot of these different things, and some of them might be more correct than others. Some of them aren't necessarily more correct than others. They're just specific to different situations and different groups. But the main point is just to be really meaningful and intentional with the language you use and to be in tune with both the professional community and the self-advocates community of people with lived experience in these different groups. And that, again, we're not experts in most of these population areas. And so we appreciate anyone with expertise who would love to share that with other care farms and especially with other people who are interested in starting care farms, as they're probably the most in need of building out their language and applying for grants and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Really appreciate it. I'm going to skip ahead to the very last slide, and then we're going to open it up for discussion because exactly what Gabrielle was just saying. We're looking to create kind of a community of practice, a focus group, if you will. If this information is resonating with you, if you have really strong ideas, I know that we're not going to have enough time with the 20 or so minutes that we have left for discussion to get to many of the things that might be rising up or that you have wisdom to share in. So this is my email. And so please reach out. Don't know exactly yet when we'll be meeting. And a lot of that's just going to depend on who's interested in being a part of this work. But please send an email if this is just something that you feel like you really want to stay involved in. And that is, again, I don't know how many times we'll say the word evolving during this, but this is an evolving practice. So as we move into a discussion here, I'm going to just put a couple prompts. And then I will close down the sharing so I can also look in the chat and see what might be there. But through this presentation, is anything coming up that really feels limiting or confusing or really misrepresentative? Key concepts that you still feel like need clearer definitions? What new language or terminology should we as a network be exploring? Anything that you've moved away from because it just didn't feel like a term that was relevant or empowering. So those are just a couple prompts. As I said, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share. And I think we have quite a few people on the call. If anybody, as I go into the chat, wants to jump in, you can either raise your hand. Maybe that's a good feature to use. I see Eliza, you're raising your hand.
Hi, yeah. I was just wondering if something that keeps on coming up with us is we have um a bunch of we have a whole bunch of people coming to help on the farm. And some of them have intellectual disabilities and some don't. Most of them are volunteers. And sometimes it's important to clarify who has intellectual disabilities and who doesn't. Like they're all volunteers and uh like it just gets clunky. And I was wondering if other people have these I mean, uh, they're doing similar stuff, but generally the people without disabilities are helping the other people with disabilities do tasks. But they're not really, they're all just kind of working together. But in terms of us organizing things, we need to make sure that there's a certain amount of people who can be predominantly in a guiding and helping level. Anyway, it's if you understand what I'm talking about, I just have a hard time figuring out. Like we have a staff, that's easy. We have like people with disabilities that have jobs, that's easy. That's just the name of their job. But this kind of big group of people who are, continuously coming in and are very much part of the community, we don't have clear words for. So if anybody has clear words, I would love to know what they are.
Anyone want to jump in there? You cracked that nut? Have an idea?
Is there like
Anyone
a
else?
formal separation or like system for having volunteers with IDDs and without IDDs? Like, are those, for example, two separate applications, or are those volunteers sourced from two different places? Or is it kind of like different organizations, for example? Or is it kind of just like whoever wants to volunteer, if you have IDDs or if you don't, and then once you're in the organization as a volunteer, that's when you kind of get, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because we're still we just keep on getting new people. Like on certain days, it's a day hab group. So it's easy for us to say it's the
Yeah.
group. And then there's their aides. So like that's simple. But like on a farm volunteer day, we don't
Mhm.
know who we're gonna, like we're gonna get. And like so we have individuals coming, we have families coming, and it doesn't really matter. I mean, to me personally, it doesn't matter in person, but like when you're talking about your program or you're trying to say this many people with disabilities versus
Mhm.
it
Yeah.
gets very clunky and I'm sure we'll kind of come up with a system as things gel. But so I was just kind of wondering if anybody else has like what their systems were.
Hey, Eliza, this is Katie from the specialty crop. And I hear what you're saying, and I love how gentle you were when you brought it up. Like, how do we address this kind of? It's a little bit uncomfortable. Um, but I wonder if you, as your volunteers are coming in, are you having them sign a form so that you could kind of establish like a mentor, like mentor volunteer and farmer volunteer.
Oh, that's
I
nice.
wonder if there's like a name you could
Mentor
assign
volunteer. That's what
to
I'm
it.
looking for.
Yeah.
Mentor volunteer. No, we have to get more paperworky, unfortunately, and we will do all of that. But mentor volunteer is perfect.
Well, and you don't have to necessarily use a piece of paperwork to define that, but maybe ask them, you know, would you consider yourself a mentor farmer or a mentor volunteer or a farmer volunteer?
Right. That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And one thing that I would add there is to just not assume that people with disabilities can't be mentors, right? And
Oh, of
so
course they
that's,
can. I
and
know.
I know
Yeah.
that that's just the sort of hang up on using one term to define something that more than, that a neurodiverse population could be
Well,
part
yeah, I
of.
don't think it really matters. I don't really care about, I mean, I personally just feel like we're all disabled. So to me, like this whole thing is kind of ridiculous. But you do need to clarify like who needs, like what people's roles are. And you don't want to, like a mentorship means, oh, this person is capable of that kind of role. And so I think that would work fine, whether they had disability, like obvious disabilities or not.
I see
Does that make
Becca.
sense?
Becca's
Before I just wanted to point out some people are also leaving words in the chat. So to look at that in addition, but yeah, sorry to Becca.
yeah,
Hey,
Becca.
oh,
Oh, you
so
are.
at
Oh.
Red Wiggler, we have we have a huge volunteer pool, both volunteers with IDD and not, in addition to our staff. So we deal with this question all the time in terms of when folks come to the farm and how best to assign roles, and then also as we're planning ahead of time based on what we know about folks coming. So I don't have any like sage wisdom that's I could handle in 30 seconds, but Eliza, I'm happy to talk to you offline about this and talk through kind of our onboarding system and how we designate. One thing I'll say when I am onboarding volunteers who may have a disability or may not, I think of it in terms of supports. So I might describe something as a supported shift. So might be a shorter volunteer shift and something that, yeah, volunteer and training, but something that just comes with a few more guardrails, and is good for folks with lower stamina or who are newer to farming. And that supported shift could be for someone with a diagnosis they want to share, or for someone who's like terrified of farming. So thinking about it in terms of how many supports they might need, as opposed to a binary yes or no, you have a disability and thus like you are limited. I try to think of it that way. And I'll put my email in the chat.
Thanks. That'd be great.
A question for Kate. Could we bring up the slide just for having those prompts up on here?
Sure.
If it doesn't stop us from seeing each other.
Yeah, I am curious. I don't see any other direct questions in the chat right now. So here are some prompts. Just curious, like anyone have a concept that wasn't a term that wasn't raised today? Or are you hearing words, phrases, terms that, well, I guess that weren't raised because we might not even know about them? Feels like fascinating. I'm fascinated by language. You know, when the beginning of each year when you get to read the whole list of new words that have come up in the last year, I always love those.
Mikey Hayes wrote, I'm curious if there's any good alternatives to spectrum. I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. it seems like you're also, oh yeah, go ahead.
Hi there. Yeah, I know back at the conference, it came up that the term spectrum can be limiting for people because it kind of turns it into a binary rather like with one end of like high function and one end of low function. Um, so I'm wondering if we have alternatives to uh, disability spectrum that would be inclusive for everyone that also demonstrate the fact that it's not a scale in that way.
Gabrielle,
Um,
do you have that image handy that you just posted on your Instagram?
yeah, well, I have the image I used for it. Yeah, so I posted a meme yesterday. Um, So as someone diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, one thing that and I think it's really funny that you said binary because the color spectrum is anything but binary. And we do see just color spectrum before we even get into like how the word spectrum is used. We see two different representations of the color spectrum. One is like this kind of bar of like it's a visible light spectrum like from red to purple and everything. But usually like when we see the color spectrum, it's like this big circle or like this big chart of it's like a matrix, like when you're, for example, selecting a color to make like a graphic design on Canva, and it's like the RGB and the this and that. So yeah, so a spectrum is anything, but binary. But we do often see. I guess I'll pull up the okay Instagram because I that's the only place where I have those two images back to back against each other. And it's really funny that you brought that up. But oh darn, it's not letting me link directly to
It's
it.
perfect timing because I literally screenshot Gabrielle's.
Oh, are you able to share it in the chat somehow?
I can try.
Okay. But yeah, so basically, I don't think that spectrum is like the only thing about the word spectrum, like what Gracht said in the chat, is that like it usually is associated with autism, even though spectrum can refer to many things. But basically, like I guess the first part is just thinking about like spectrum is not it's not binary and it's not just like low to medium to high. And the image I put in the chat is just it's one of many useful visualizations of, for example, the autism spectrum, where it's this multidimensional thing of different support needs. And access needs. So instead of functioning levels, especially as was talked about before, you're thinking of instead of like, oh, like the people who need help or the people who don't need help, it's more like, okay, there's a volunteer. What do they need help with? And so, or like, what accommodations even do they already know how to advocate and accommodate for themselves in order to do their job better? Like, if they know that bees are going to trigger them, let's have them maybe work with things that aren't like the pollinator flowers if you have different options on your farm. Or if they know that, I don't know, like they have trouble doing things on their own than having them with a buddy, whereas not everyone needs a buddy. So it's more about like what do they need, not just like do they need or do they not need. Um, but to actually answer your question, um, spectrum. I guess like I don't know, a thesaurus, just like variety, like a there's definitely a better word that I'm not thinking of when it comes to just like a broad range of like disabilities and abilities. Like a broad variety range of like support needs, abilities, skills. It really just depends what you're talking about, but I agree with what someone said in the chat that the word spectrum can be often associated with autism even when you're not talking about autism. And there's a word. I know there's a word. If anyone else thinks of it, let me know, but like to refer to I guess it's just like the diversity of like needs and I don't know, the diversity of support needs and skills, or like I might not be even remembering exactly how you rephrased your question, but yeah.
Well, Eliza had a note in here, multiplicity.
Multiplicity.
That's a
Yeah.
love that. Yeah. And Cynthia is also noting in the chat here about in the field of social work, there's a lot of talk about asking clients or participants and their families what terminology they prefer, exactly
Yeah.
for the reasons that you're mentioning. So sometimes, yeah, the most recently published scholarship on use of language will posit one term, but it becomes meaningless or worse, offensive to the actual person you are working with because they do not use that latest term. I think this speaks a bit to, Gabrielle, what you were talking about as well, kind of self-advocates reclaiming some of the terminology.
I have one, it's I think more of a comment than a question, but just one thing that I find challenging from a fundraising perspective is matching donors' language. So when we are feeling like we're trying to be as up to date and as inclusive of terms that our population is telling us that they want to use, and then we go and are applying for grants or whatnot that then have what I would consider outdated terms. And I guess I do have a question, which is how do people deal with that? I know what I tend to do is use their language in the first line along with the language that we use, and then continue on using the language that we use. Curious what others do.
Any grant writers? Jamie, you had to have written a grant at some point.
Yes, but I'll admit, what was the question? I got a text from one of my staff, so I was answering her. We have a goat that's about to kid, so I was.
Oh,
That's very exciting. We could switch gears to that. The question was if a funder uses different language than you use internally, how do you sort of deal with that?
Always know that language is a tool that we use to describe what we're doing. So just like if you were to go to Germany, you would want to speak German to communicate what you're doing in the US that you think about in English. So always use the language parameters that your funders, foundation, grant, blah, blah, blah. And a little tip about grant writing, research the grant and use the language they're using, because these poor people review hundreds, if not thousands, of grant applications. And if they are efficient and effective as a board, they're going to kick out something, especially with care farming. It's kind of out of the box right now. And so if you're not showing this commonality, then they're going to just kick you out, and that's the end of it. So don't pretend that you're, you need to try to understand what they're communicating, what they want to fund, and then again, use their language to show them that that is what in fact you're doing. Did that help answer the question? I will pay attention now. The goat is not in labor. She just was laying down.
If
well,
you're going
please
to
do.
if you're going to do grants that you're asking for funding that's required for insurance, etc., you're going to be using diagnostic assessment. We used to have syndromes. That was a collection of symptoms, and then became a diagnosis, and the syndromes went away and it's been replaced now with spectrum. You have autism spectrum, you have ADHD spectrum, you have fetal alcohol spectrum. Those are all switching over to spectrum, and I'm sure that's going to be gone before too long. Because if you need some specificity, like you were talking about with the people reviewing grants, they're going to want to know whether it's something that is going to fit into a category that insurance companies are going to require, such as the DSM. And DSM is the collection of symptoms too, but it must have an impairment. And that's the direct opposite of when we want to talk about ability. Then we have to talk about the impairment, or you don't have a diagnosis.
One thing too, I'll say before I forget, Kate, I loved your definitions of like what a care farm is, what it isn't. Kenneth, when you were talking about insurance and liability, so I'm in Texas. We had to get insurance under an agritourism as an agritourism entity because care farming is not recognized. And even though Simple Sparrow, we host therapies for there's licensed professionals that meet their clients here. Simple Sparrow is not a clinic. We are a care farm. So we teach the trauma-informed therapeutic methods and then train the therapists how to use the farm for their clients. And it was really important for our board because we did not want to take on any liability of being a clinic. And so the way we could navigate and stay open and not pay an exorbitant amount for therapy by being JACO, HIPAA, blah, blah, blah. We had to fall under an agritourism. And then that is also our signage out the front. And everybody who comes has to fill out a general liability waiver. And guess what? Our litigation attorney, it's agritourism. So right now, again, with the Care Farming Network kind of growing and evolving, we don't have that language yet in a lot of legislation on care farms. And so you might find with your state, you do have to fall under that agritourism umbrella right now.
It's the same thing that people have switched from being counselors to being coaches, but then nobody wants to pay for coaching. And that's kind of where you're at.
Yeah.
You know, the person first language came out of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that had an exclusion. If there was a culture, you don't need to do person first. Now we've gone into the area where people are becoming much more able to discriminate and to be prejudiced than they were even 2 years ago. But what's happening is that people first thing is a person with a disability. And the other one is if you're deaf, that's a deaf culture. However, if you have autism, that's not a culture. If you have schizophrenia, that's not a culture. So we'll think of it in terms of what the culture is. If there is a culture based on that disability, then it's not, you don't have to be person first to be politically correct. But right now, I wouldn't worry about too much because nobody's becoming politically correct anymore.
Becca, did you have your hand up?
Yes, and I know we're at time, so I can just be super fast, but I just wanted to say something that I've been thinking about, which is that the beginning of your presentation, Kate, you shared some really subtle and lovely language to use in place of kind of blunt language. Like instead of this, consider saying this when referring to care farming and therapeutic practices. And I love that. And it's great for writing in particular, but something that I struggle with as an ambassador of the farm and of care farming is like getting your point across quickly with few words, clearly, that doesn't sound, that can kind of, I turn it into word salad when I'm talking, right? So this may be something I pose to the group is like putting into practice describing care farming in really clear terms that are so reflective of this like evolution. Because I noticed that like the first sentence was short and then it turned into something that was like twice or three times as long. And so how to keep that subtlety and evolution while also having clarity and directness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate that point. And it's one of the reasons that we've moved into even just the definition of care farming that we use at Care Farming Network, which is short and concise. Because I think especially when it's new terminology and people are trying to get their heads wrapped around it, yeah, brevity is your friend, right? And impact and like you just want to kind of punch them with a new definition. So thanks. Well, we are at time. One quick reminder before we go is that we do have our second open hour, which is going to be taking place on April 15th, which is a drop-in office hour. Both myself and Andrea are there. So if you have a question, something kind of banging around in your head that you might need a little bit of help with, or an idea, please do. drop in the Zoom link. You can find that on our events page. Otherwise, this recording as well as the presentation is going to be shared out after. Again, if you open invitation to anybody that would like to be part of this ongoing work, maybe you'll think of something as you're falling asleep at night and want to share it too. Please feel free to get in touch. And thank you for being a part of this, taking time out of your day. Care Farming, we are here to build awareness around this thing. This is how we do it. And really appreciate your expertise, knowledge, care, and just time today. So with that, we look forward to seeing you at a future event and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.